Most people understand grading as a way to protect a card and verify its condition. That is part of it, but it does not explain why grading matters financially or why some cards are worth submitting and others are not. I'm Ryan, founder of Pulltrader, and I want to break down what grading actually does, where the value comes from, and how to decide whether a card is worth sending in. There is plenty of content explaining what grading is. You send a card to a grading company, they evaluate its condition, assign it a grade, and encapsulate it. That part is easy. What is rarely explained well is how to use grading as a financial and collecting decision. That gap is where a lot of people lose money. The common assumption is that grading automatically adds value, and you send a card away, it comes back in a slab, and suddenly it's worth more. That's just not how it works. The card itself has not changed. What has changed is the amount of information the market has about it, the level of trust buyers place in it, and the group of comparable sales against which it will now be measured. Grading primarily does four things. First, it standardizes condition. Instead of a buyer and seller independently deciding whether a card is near mint, lightly played, or somewhere in between, a third party assigns it a grade. Second, it creates trust. That becomes especially valuable when someone is buying a card online and cannot inspect it in person. Third, it makes pricing more consistent. A graded card could be compared against previous sales of the same card in the same grade, rather than against a broad range of raw copies in different conditions. And finally, grading can improve liquidity. A recognizable grade from a company that the market trusts can make a card easier to understand and in many cases easier to sell. What grading does not provide is a guaranteed increase in price. Grading is infrastructure for the card market. It creates information, trust, and standardization. It is not a money printer. And that distinction becomes especially important with modern cards, where a large portion of the grading premium is often concentrated in the highest grades. So a PSA 10 may sell for significantly more than a PSA 9 of the exact same card. Meanwhile, the difference between a raw copy and a PSA 9 may be small enough that grading fees, shipping, selling costs absorb most or all the upside. In some cases, a lower grade can even make a card harder to sell for the price you might have received while it was still raw. You have paid a grading company to establish a condition ceiling that buyers can now see. This is why you cannot look at sale price of a perfect example and assume grading your copy will create the same result. You need to understand a few things. The first is grade distribution. What does this card usually receive when submitted, and how realistic is the grade you are hoping for? The second is population. If a card already has a large and rapidly growing population in its highest grades, the supply of graded copies may eventually put pressure on the premium. The third is the type of card you're grading. Modern sports cards, vintage cards, and TCG cards do not behave identically. With a modern card, buyers may place enormous emphasis on receiving the highest possible grade because raw copies and lower grade copies are readily available. With vintage, authentication and the confirmation of a specific condition can be valuable even when the numerical grade is relatively low. With TCG cards, the outcome can depend heavily on the age of the card, the size of the raw supply, the character or player featured, the set, and the preferences of that particular collector market. The value of grading is always conditional. And that brings us to the question that actually matters. Should you grade this specific card? Do not begin by asking whether the card could receive a high grade. Almost every card could receive a high grade under the right circumstances. What grade it is realistically likely to receive is the question you need to ask. Then run the numbers for multiple outcomes. Start with the card's current raw value. Add the grading fee, shipping, insurance, any preparation or submission costs, and the selling fees you would pay after it returns. Then compare that total against realistic sales prices at each likely grade. So, what happens if it receives a 10? What happens if it receives a 9? What happens if it grades lower than expected? For many modern cards, the 10 is where the meaningful upside exists, and a 9 may leave you near break even. Anything lower may represent a loss. That does not mean you should never grade a card unless it's a guaranteed 10. No grade is guaranteed, and financial return is not the only valid reason to grade something. You might want authentication. You might want consistent storage. You might be building a graded set. You might simply prefer the card in a slab. I know I do. And those are all legitimate reasons. But when grading is being treated as an investment or resale decision, you need to evaluate the likely outcome rather than building the entire decision around the best possible one. That is the difference between making a calculated submission and buying an expensive lottery ticket. Once the math makes sense, you still have to evaluate the card itself. Most grading companies assess some version of 4 primary areas: centering, surface, corners, and edges. Centering is usually the easiest place to begin because it is visible and measurable. Check the borders on both the front and back of the card, and do not assume that a well-centered front means that the back will also meet the standard you are targeting. Surface is where many submissions go wrong. Print lines, scratches, indentations, roller marks, stains, and other defects may only become visible under direct light and at different angles. Corners and edges need the same level of attention. Small amounts of whitening, chipping, lifting, or wear may be difficult to notice until the card is viewed under magnification. You also need to understand the print quality of the specific set. Some releases are known for centering problems. Others frequently have rough edges, print lines, dimples, factory damage. You've heard the term being panini'd before. A flaw being common does not necessarily mean a grading company will ignore it. Experienced vendors reject a large percentage of cards they inspect. And that's one of the biggest differences between disciplined grading and simply sending in anything that looks clean inside a sleeve. A card that looks perfect from across a table may look very different under bright light and magnification. You should also think carefully about which grading company you use. And this is not simply a question of which company is best. The name on the slab communicates something to the market. So PSA generally offers broad recognition and strong liquidity across many categories. Beckett appeals to collectors who value subgrades and the possibility of receiving one of its highest designations, which is the Black Label. SGC has an established following, particularly among vintage and sports card collectors, and other grading companies kind of compete through technology, detailed grading reports, better turnaround time, slab design. Check out TAG. The best choice depends on the card, the market you plan to sell into, and your reason for grading it, and what buyers in that category prefer. Choosing a grading company is a positioning decision. So the main thing I want you to take away from this is simple. Stop treating grading as something that automatically creates value. Treat it as a decision. What grade is the card realistically likely to receive? What will the entire process cost? What is the card worth at each probable outcome? Does the market actually reward having this specific card graded? And are you comfortable with the result if it comes back lower than you hoped? Once you start answering those questions, grading becomes much less mysterious. You are no longer guessing, and you are no longer relying on the sale price of a perfect copy to justify every submission. You are making a decision based on condition, probability, cost, and actual market demand. That is the kind of business awareness we are building into Pulltrader and Scout. Better pricing intelligence and better decision-making tools for the collectors, dealers, and shops actually moving cards. And you can learn more about that with the link below.